Today, all of you know Dennis Voskuil. Okay, I'm crackling when I get too close. Okay, Dennis is a church historian.
Now, I'm not happy with that microphone. Could you try the other one that is right by you there? Yes. Let's try that.
Now okay, good. All right. You had to wait a long time for the introduction, so I'll have to make it even shorter. Dennis has also taught church history at Hope College. At present, he is a senior research fellow at the Van Raalte Institute, and he's my colleague there, so we enjoy each other's company, and especially coffee time with the other fellows as well. So today he is going to talk about pietism. It's a series of two. He's beginning to give an introduction to pietism in the 18th century. It's a kind of an international phenomenon, very strong in England and influenced the American Great Awakening and also Germany. And then next week, I will talk about the influence of pietism on the Netherlands, especially in the life of an early pioneer to Holland, Michigan, who left the biography. Okay, Dennis.
Well, thank you, Nella. Let's see. I think this, I don't know which one works, and this is fine as long as you're picking it up and it's working. I know this is Mother's Day, and I know that you don't want us to stay too long today, and I know Betty's home working on a lunch or a dinner for two of our children and families, so you're probably doing the same thing. But thank you for being here, and we're going to talk today about Protestant pietism from, let's say, the period from 1650 to 1800. And to understand pietism, you kind of have to break down the word a little bit. I remember never wanting to be called pious as a kid, that somehow that was a negative. And we have a misunderstanding of piety, and pietism really is rooted in the term piety, which means devoted or duty rendered to God. Those are good things. But the term itself needs the resurrection or some work on it to keep it from becoming a negative for people. So we're going to try to understand pietism as a movement. Sometimes this is called the period of Christian pietism, at least among the Americans and the Europeans. So what are the grand or the basic characteristics of pietism? Just get your arms around it a little bit. Generally, there was a strong emphasis over against the period of rationalism. In other words, during the same time that you have pietism, like say 1650 to 1800, this is the period of the Age of Reason. And Christianity was bent in a couple ways. The rational Christians, and there were many of those, including John Locke, who believed that everything which is true could be understood through the individual's reasoning powers. So a rational understanding of the Christian faith became the way the rationalists took things. And Locke is just one. I can't go into the rationalism or rational Christianity, but you have to understand that was the context in which the pietists emerged. There was this strong enlightenment. We finally are going to understand the world if we're honest with ourselves. The individual and reason would do it, open everything to us. It was all we needed finally to get out of the haze of superstition and doctrine and whatever, and now our individual reasoning ability would do that. But that was taking place exactly the same time that we have this age of piety. It seems a countervailing force in some ways, a reaction against a rational understanding of the Christian faith. We're talking here about Christians in all cases. So, what are the general characteristics of pietism? Well, there's a primacy, or there's a tendency to emphasize human feeling, the emotions, not just the mind, but the emotions. The heart, not the head, is primary. Laity is allowed to develop leadership, and there's a strong emphasis upon the laity and the leadership of the laity rather than the clergy, the authorities. Biblically centered, the Bible-centered movement, emphasis upon guilt, human guilt and salvation, and therefore God's grace. While there's sin, there is grace, and there's a strong emphasis upon that. Also, in most cases, an emphasis upon conversion experiences. That was part of the piety of people, that somehow they experience a change in their lives. And of course, Jesus is the model for the way we live as people. Look to Jesus' life and live like Jesus. This isn't saying that other kind of traditions didn't emphasize this as well, but this is important among the pietists. Emphasis upon the common folk, that the Christian faith should reach down into all levels of society. And as I said, personal conversions are important, and in some cases, especially with the Methodists who are part of this, hymn singing was emphasized as a way of living our lives. So it's important to understand these basic characteristics as we get into pietism. And I know I'm hurrying along here, but your outlines, if you can read them, might help. I don't type very well, and I had Friday afternoon sitting in the office where Nell and I live during the week. I realized that I wasn't going to get anybody to type this, and not being a typist myself, as a matter of fact, I was a lousy typist and always have been. Betty and I are in the same typing class in high school, and I remember getting up to 15 net words during the semester, and she was doing 120 words a semester, but we both got A's, and that is something that rankles her to this very day. I don't blame her, but remember, my improvement was such that I deserved it when I got up to 15 plus words. That's taking away all the errors and so forth. But Betty, if you're listening, I'm sorry, but I deserved it because of my great improvement that semester. I'm going to talk about three major areas of Protestant pietism. German pietism, the evangelical movement in Great Britain, and often the Methodists are cited here as the pietists of that movement, but there were others. And finally, in America, remember, we have colonies in America under British control, and in America, we call this movement the Great Awakening, the first Great Awakening. There was a second and perhaps a third and maybe a fourth, but the first one is the one we're talking about in the 1740s. There's the time period that we're going to focus on, about the 1740s, around that period. Okay, quickly, let's go to the awakening in Germany, the German pietism. There are certain figures that we could talk about. Philip Jakob Spener is one of those. And he developed this is in the Lutheran churches in Germany, which could, in many cases, become very rationalistic or scholastic. Going back to kind of getting the right doctrines was important. The Pietism was a reaction against both rationalism and scholasticism, that you believe the right doctrines and that's all you need. And we'd be fighting over doctrinal precision, whether we're Lutherans or Reformed or whatever. That's one thing that the Pietists reacted against. Another was, of course, a rationalist understanding of the Christian faith, the head versus the heart. So Spener developed what were called circles of piety, collegia pietatis, circles of piety, groups coming together and reading the Bible and praying together. That was a major thing for his movement. And he wrote a book, Pieta Sederia, which is important for the movement. But more important, are these lay people coming together in groups to nurture their understanding of the Scripture and to nurture each other. Lay involvement, evangelistic preaching, preaching for conversions, which was not part of the Protestant tradition after the Reformation generally. Okay? That's important because that's created a lot of reaction, but also it has had a great place in the history of American Christianity especially. And deciding that it was important for reorganizing the universities who were the trainers of pastors. There weren't seminaries in Europe. The first seminary really was New Brunswick, to be honest. I'm getting that, you get it out for the RCA. But in Europe, they were part of the universities. And the training in the universities was not so much oriented toward pastoral care, it was more oriented toward right thinking. And the Pietists under Spener and others changed that. Another Pietist in Germany was August Hermann Francke, who was a follower of Spener. He was a disciple of Spener, and he operated at the University of Halle in Germany, and this is in northern Germany. And he had a huge role to play in preparing pastors. That university became a pastoral training center for the Pietists. And Halle had a great impact in a lot of different ways. It also became the training center for missionaries, because one of the things that happened during the Pietist movement in Germany was the emphasis on missions in other lands, India and other places. And where you prepared for that was at the University of Halle. He also developed a school for the poor, a Bible institute there, and a kind of a house for publishing. So now this pietistic German background folks, these folks began to produce literature that was being used. And if you talk about what's positive and what's negative about German pietism, what's positive, of course, is the awakening of a lot of people in terms of their understanding of Christ. And it did have a tremendous impact on the mission movement. It was an awakening for Protestantism among many of the Lutherans in Germany. Also, there was one other person that we could talk about, and his name is not on my list, but it's Count von Zinzendorf, who was a figure who was a friend of the Wesleys, and he came to America. He was looking for, there was a group called the Moravians that traced way back to, remember, the Hussites, Jan Hus. I have to come back and do some more of this. Anyway, he was influenced by the Hussites, or the Moravians, who developed out of the Hussites, and he came to America. And he was a count. He was very wealthy. He was among the aristocracy. He came to America, and he's the one that named, just for Trivial Pursuit, he's the one that named Nazareth and Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, when he toured America. You're not going to get that anyplace else. So anyway, von Zinzendorf was one of those followers of Pietism among the upper reaches of society. So the impact improved the quality of ministry, it improved the quality of training for ministry, it helped develop lay groups within the churches. It was a revitalization of the faith of German Lutherans, and Reformed as well, by the way, and we're not talking about that group in Germany. Then let's move to Great Britain, and a movement you probably know more about than you do about the Pietism in Germany. A lot of you know about the Wesleys and George Whitefield, who were part of the Holy Club at Oxford University. This developed out of the University of Oxford in England. The Wesleys were sons of a pastor. But by the way, our mother of the day is Susanna Wesley. Okay, we need an honorary mother of the day. And Susanna Wesley was the mother of John and Charles and 8 other Wesley kids, by the way. I think they were the only 2 sons. She had a lot of daughters, and she was something. She was a strong woman. I just got to tell you Susanna Wesley's story. She and her husband, who was a pastor, of course, in the Anglican Church, he and she disagreed politically. Now, this is the era of William and Mary, and she was opposed to William and Mary. She thought they were upstarts from the Netherlands. And she was strongly supportive of the king who was rousted out of England at that time. If you know your English history, you might remember that. That makes no difference. She stood up to her husband. He said, I am the boss of this family, and we are going to pray for the William and Mary, because they are now the king and queen of England. And she says, no. And for about 6 months, they would not even come together in the same bedroom. And she stood her ground until finally he caved in. You don't get that anyplace else either. So there's a story you can take home with you on Mother's Day. This is a strong mother. And by the way, Susanna Wesley nurtured her sons, Charles and John. And she was a very important figure. So she's a mother of the day. This Holy Club in Oxford, it was very important in seeding some of the leaders of the Anglican Church and who moved toward a more pietistic understanding of the faith. And John Wesley was maybe the most important figure out of this, but George Whitefield and Charles Wesley are also important. John Wesley's spiritual journey is very interesting. We've talked about Susanna Wesley. He almost died in a fire at Epworth, which was where his father was a pastor in the city of Epworth. And he almost died. He said he was plucked from the flames, plucked from the disaster, from the flames. And it affected the way he lived. He, like his brother Charles, journeyed to Georgia, the colony, where a guy named Oglethorpe was the governor. And John Wesley was rather, he was not a kind of warm, friendly kind of character. His brother was much more so. But John Wesley made enemies in Georgia. Charles went back home after 6 months. John stayed there because he was persistent. But he got in trouble in one way because he fell in love with a young lady who was 18 years old named Sophie Hopke. And Sophie Hopke was the niece of the governor, Oglethorpe. And he fell in love with her. He truly loved her, but he could not bring himself to ask her to marry him. He believed that God was calling him to missionary work and he shouldn't get married. She was jilted. She married somebody else, and John Wesley then refused to allow her to take communion because of her sins. And you can see that doesn't bode well for his life there. And he eventually is asked to leave because he made enemies and he got to go back to England. But while he was there, he met some Moravians, those Hussite, more modern Hussites. And there, while he was there, and by the way, on a ship that brought him there, there was a terrible storm. And he was frightened to death. I mean, he was literally frightened to death. Here he was a pastor, or he was just out of theological school. He was a pastor, and he was frightened to death. But a group of ordinary folks who were from the Moravian background, from the Hussite background, were praying and at peace because they knew if they died, they were okay. This troubled him. And he asked one of the leaders of the Moravians in Georgia what was going on. His name was Spangenberg. And he said, we know who we are, and we are safe, and we know we are saved in Christ. And this affected Wesley because he didn't feel that he was worthy of salvation. Okay? Here's a minister who didn't feel worthy of salvation. So anyway, John Wesley was a very important figure in this movement. He eventually, at Aldersgate in 1738, at a place in one of these piety circles, in England, he was hearing a lecture or discussion on Luther's preface to his commentary on Romans, and he felt his heart strangely warmed. Okay, having served the Methodist Church in the Boston area when I was in grad school, I heard about Wesley and the warmed heart. So this affected him, and he was never the same after that. He became interested in revivalism. and in a life change and so forth. So John Wesley, with his warmed heart and his conversion at Aldersgate, became an important figure in this movement. And so did George Whitefield, one of his friends at Oxford, who was not to become a Methodist. Whitefield became a kind of a Reformed Methodist, if you want to call him that. He believed in the basic principle of God's utter sovereignty, but he also believed in conversion, and he believed in working for conversion. So George Whitefield actually became the one who came to America and had incredible success. I was reading last night about Whitefield as the most popular and well-known person in the colonies. 50% of the American people knew of him. He was preaching before crowds of up to 30,000 people in Philadelphia. None other than the deist Benjamin Franklin just raved about this guy. He said he could speak and you could hear him miles and miles away, and people were enraptured by his speaking. This is Franklin. This is Franklin. So this guy had an incredible impact in America. He did a number of tours to America and preaching and having revivals in America. And he had a tremendously impressive one actually in New England, which seems beyond revival to a lot of people today. But he was able to do it, going to New England, his tour of New England. And matter of fact, he died in Massachusetts on the last of his great tours of America. So you've got George Whitefield as the grand itinerant, and he's the one that really impacted America of all those English folks like the Wesleys. And finally we come to the Great Awakening in America, and here we can talk about Theodore Jacob Frelinghuysen, one of our own. Here was a man who was a kind of from the eastern part of the Netherlands, next to Germany. And he was influenced by not German pietism, but Dutch pietism, which Nella may get into next week. And he felt a call, but the call he thought was to Belgium. When he found out that Raritan is not in Belgium, but it's in the United States, or what was the colonies at that time, New Jersey, he followed his call and he felt he had to go, so he did. He showed up in New York where the Dutch Reformed pastors of New York City welcomed him. There weren't a lot of folks, and he was coming to America. He got off the ship and he was invited to come to the church of one of the Dominies. And when he walked in the Dominies parsonage after the service, he had a fit. Why? Because the Dominie had a huge mirror. Vanity. And he was upset, and he took after this pastor for this monstrous mirror where vanity and glory in yourself and all that kind of stuff. You can see he didn't hit it off. And Frelinghuysen, when he came and developed a kind of revivalism in the Reformed Church, created enemies. And there were two separate groups, the pro-conversion or a conversion-type revivalism, and those who opposed that. And for a long while, these groups did not come together, not until the 1770s. And he was here in the 1740s originally. Not until the 1770s did John Henry Livingston bring together the two groups. Now that's another day of discussion among us. So finally, I want to talk a little, I could talk about the Frelinghuysen forever too, but I wanted to just mention the Tennant brothers and father. The Tennants were the Presbyterian versions in New Jersey and New York and Pennsylvania of Frelinghuysen in the Dutch Reformed tradition. They were friends of Frelinghuysen, by the way. And William Tennant, the father of Gilbert and John and so forth, had a college actually in a log cabin. It's called the Log Cottage in the Chamonix, Pennsylvania. You can look it up. It became what was Princeton College later, okay, when it went to New Jersey. So there's another tidbit for those of you who play Trivial Pursuit. And Gilbert Tennant, one of the sons, became known probably more than his brother William and John for his preaching and his revivalism. He followed Whitefield on the revival trail. And his sermon that is most quoted, I guess, is Dangers of an Unconverted Ministry, which some of us in seminary or school had to read, which is a cry against those who were themselves dead men, who were the preachers. And this can follow up to the present day when a lot of folks who are revivalists in their intentions are upset with those who are pastors who haven't had this dramatic conversion experience. But that's another presentation on revivalism in America alone. So then we come to Jonathan Edwards, probably the name that you know most, because he's a literary figure as well as a pastor in Northampton, Massachusetts. He was a brilliant man, a great philosopher, theologian. Jonathan Edwards is probably the most touted philosopher of the colonial America. Jonathan Edwards, whose father was the pastor of Northampton Congregational Church. Solomon Stoddard was his name, and Jonathan came to take Solomon Stoddard's church, and he made some changes in membership requirements. Okay, he wanted to make membership in the church meaningful. Those only who could confess that they were born again. They don't use those terms. Awakened may be one that they would use, but that they knew that they were changed in heart. Only those people could become members of the church according to his desires. Well, the church in Northampton, who were devoted to Solomon Stoddard, his grandfather, didn't agree with that because Solomon Stoddard didn't agree with that. So what did they do? The most highly recognized name in American theological history, they kicked him out. He ended up having to go to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and work among the Native Americans because he later, by the way, became the first president of Princeton Seminary. So all of this is for your trivial pursuit. But anyway, he wrote something called The Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God in the Saving of Many Hundreds of Souls in Northampton. Not the kind of title that's going to make it big today, but that was the title of his book. And he detailed what happened as the Holy Spirit took hold of people in his church, especially the young people who were into frolics, and all of a sudden became serious about the faith, and they were converted and slain. And he wrote about this, the work of God in saving many hundreds of souls in Northampton. So finally, I know we're not home yet, but we're getting close to the car. What were the lasting effects of the Great, and I might even have some questions that you have, the lasting impact of the Great Awakening? Well, it had a great impact on America, not just in terms of the religious or Christian dimensions, but on the very demography of America. Denominational demography, for instance. Those who were involved in the revivals of the First Great Awakening were those churches that took hold and grew, and those who didn't. And there's one of the things about the Reformed Church. The Dutch Reformed Church was resistant in general to much of this revivalism. And so were certain kinds of Presbyterians and certain Congregationalists. So what happens at this period, we have a division between the old lights, those who were doing the things the old way, and the new lights. As a matter of fact, in the Presbyterian tradition, you even use those terms, the New Light Presbyterians and the Old Light Presbyterians, the New Light Congregationalists and the Old Light Congregationalists. In the Reformed Church, Frelinghuysen had an impact, and in a sense there was New Light, there was Old Light, but it didn't have as great an impact as it did in the Presbyterian and Congregationalist churches of the time. So denominational demography was affected by it. The increase in the number of people who were actually members of churches increased. It did grab people. They were turned toward Christ. You could actually, it's hard to get the statistics, but we know that the churches grew in numbers, and we know that there were many new churches begun after the First Great Awakening. Okay, so, it kind of set a pattern, because in the United States, more so than in Europe, revivalism became a pattern for religious Christian life. And revivalism, I mean, if you lived in the South much, or if you became part of certain traditions in the North, some Baptist traditions, you know that revivalism is still a staple, a summer staple in many churches. You have revivals. And they're not in the woods. They're not kind of the old-fashioned kind of very simple revivals. Now they're much more gotten up. And one of the great features of American Christianity is revivalism, a second Great Awakening in the early 1800s, a third Great Awakening in the time of Moody at the beginning of the 20th century, and maybe even a fourth Great Awakening, although we're maybe still waiting for that fourth Great Awakening today. Anyway, those are some of the characteristics and the impacts of the Great Awakening and these figures that we've been talking about. So I'll be quiet here and ask for any questions for clarification or comments that would add light to our discussion and understanding. And then you have to tell me when we have to quit, Nella. Now? Or do we need to end it now? Okay. I love questions.
Yeah, I suppose if people need to go for dinner, they
Oh,
can
sure.
get up. But otherwise, let's just stay for questions.
I'm coming home, Betty.
Okay, Rob.
This is sort of out of the circle of your comments, but what was the relationship between the Pietists and the Catholic Church and Catholics?
Some Catholic writers have said that they had their own version of this, but it certainly was not like what we're talking about with Whitefield and the Wesleys and Jonathan Edwards. Remember, Catholics came, the emergence of Catholicism in the United States in a measurable way did not happen really till the end of the 19th century. So the impact of Catholicism was there, certainly, but it didn't have a kind of a, Protestantism ruled until beginning in the 1870s and 80s when people started coming more from Germany and France, not so much. They were the early ones that came from France. But then when you get to the countries, Italy and Poland, then you have the major waves, and Germans, of course, but major waves of Catholicism. And Catholicism had its own. There's a book I have in my library called Catholic Revivalism. So there was an impact. In other words, Protestantism did affect the way Catholicism in America operated. And some would say that's good, and some would say it's not good. But it was more of a democratization of the Catholic system, which did impact American Catholicism. Even though there was warning against this, there's another presentation, against the Americanization of the Catholic Church from the Vatican. There was concern about that around the turn of the 20th century. So that's a great comment, but in terms of revivalism at this point among Catholics, it was too early. Great question.
Dennis, a lot of us remember having read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
Yeah.
And would that be almost synonymous with this great awakening? Would it have been the standard bearer kind of sermon for this period?
I appreciate your comment. I was going to mention that. It was not even typical of Edwards' sermons. This is something that some of you have been put through in literature classes, reading that. That's not even typical of Edwards. If you want to read Edwards, read something called The Nature of True Virtue, read Religious Affections, almost anything other than that sermon, which was atypical. Yeah, I'm not saying he didn't preach it, but that was not necessarily the standard fare from Edwards. He was an incredibly interesting character who wrote out his sermons on the backsides of bills in little bitty print. And it was very careful. That sermon, if you read it, and most of you probably have heard of it at least, is not a I mean, I'm not saying that he didn't preach for conversion in his church. He did. He talked in the 1740s about the harvest of many souls, and that people and kids were in frolics. He liked that term, frolics, where they were getting together in conventions of both sexes, and they were having. This doesn't sound like what takes place at Holland today at night among teenagers, but it was pretty mild stuff. But he was concerned about that, and so he saw many of these people who were frolicking come to Christ in his revivals. So yeah, that was the one that would catch the literature. Those who decide what to put in American literature textbooks. But it's a little unfair to judge Edwards by the sinners in the hand of an angry God sermon. You probably wouldn't want to. At Harvard, one of the things we had to do in one of our classes was read The Nature of True Virtue by Edwards. It was a struggle. I mean, it was dense. One book, we spent the whole semester, and it was one of my least favorite semesters of all. And it was Reinhold Niebuhr's nephew who taught it, and Richard R. Niebuhr. And he wasn't as good as Don Bruking in teaching church history. And it was the dullest class I've ever taken, plodding through, word for word, to The Nature of True Virtue, which was just a thin little book. So you brought a bad memory there for me. But Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God, that's not typical either. Which other what book?
Which other books by him would you recommend?
Of Edwards?
By Edwards.
Of Edwards. Well, I think that Religious Affections, where he talks about the conversion taking place, the surprising work of God in the saving of many hundred souls in Northampton, that was read by the Wesleys in England. It was a very popular work, and it was very influential. I mean, this guy was a genius. This guy was a boy genius. His grandfather and his father were very prominent, and Jonathan Edwards goes to the top of the heap when it comes to American intellectuals, even today. And he wasn't rediscovered until the 1950s. Nobody read Edwards, and now he's first thing you read when you get the textbooks, American Lit. Yes, anything else? Any other questions? Anything else?
Just a comment about Whitefield, that he was cross-eyed, apparently.
About who?
Whitefield was
Oh.
cross-eyed, so he probably saw twice the numbers, of people.
Whitefield.
That's for trivia, if you
Whit-
want more things.
Whitefield is said to have been that over 50% of the American colonists knew of Whitefield or had heard Whitefield preach. He preached to 30,000 people in Philadelphia in one shot. And so he was a popular figure. And if even Ben Franklin was awed by Whitefield, not just his voice, but his ability to connect with people, he must have been something. I wish we had a tape recording of Whitefield's preaching. That would be interesting.
The other question is the name Methodism. You would think method, in the context of what they stood for, doesn't seem the right name for it.
That was a mocking name that was embraced. That often happens when you're made fun of because you're worried about methods of living. That was something that the Methodists took seriously. My mother grew up as a Methodist, so I'm always very careful about what I say about Methodists. And my father grew up a staunch Christian reformer, so we had some conflicts in the family about what was piety and what wasn't. But the Methodists took seriously that we should live. Didn't John Wesley say, live as you should, even if you don't believe it, because you might learn, you might come to understand it and appreciate it. In other words, live a clean, happy life, and your life may indeed become that. I mean, something of that nature. That's not a good quote. Maybe Don knows a better way of putting it, but that was one of his methods. Live your life according to the way you want to live it, and you will become that. It's kind of an Arminian. That's something I will talk about someday when anybody who wants to be really bored. I can talk about the difference between Arminianism and Calvinism in American theology. Anything else? I know you got to get home. I got to get home. Betty's waiting
Okay.
for me.
Egg.
One more. No, that's
Yes.
okay. Yeah, that's fine. She always asks questions. I'm used to this.
This goes off a little bit, but I think it comes out of the same time frame and would be very specific to the Reformed Church. I recently heard what I need clarification on as to how the early Dutch settlers, which preceded the English, came off the boat with the framework that has become a constitution, of which the Reformed Church may be the earliest to own and continue to use. Is there any value or help in that?
Well, that's an interesting point. I'm not a constitutional expert, but I have not heard that the Dutch came with a constitution that was kind of ready-made for America. But remember, the Netherlands was, in terms of nations of Europe, known for its openness and freedom and nurturing a sort of a democratic understanding of individuals' rights. So it isn't surprising that the Dutch and the English would be marching in the same way in a place like the New Netherlands or New Amsterdam after 1864, when a ship showed up in the harbor of New York, and the Dutch there said, "We give up." And so there was no fight, there was no battle really, but it became very quickly an English colony. Sure, the Reformed Church has
The question is there still a constitution in the Reformed Church?
Absolutely, and it goes way back to John Henry Livingston, who helped to help work it. You don't start from nothing. There were Dutch versions of a constitution in the Netherlands that I'm sure he worked over for a country where there was no state church. There was the big change, that you had to develop a church in which you were one among many, because after the Revolution, there were no state churches, whether it's in the Netherlands, or whether it's in New York, or whether it's in Virginia or Massachusetts, and they were all state churches at one time, all except for those like Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, which from the very beginning allowed diversity of religious groups, but not the Dutch, not the English.
Okay, thank you very much, Dennis.
You're welcome. Thank you all. I
Have a
appreciate
happy Mother's Day, all of you.